course of the years, I've declared myself a creep magnet. Many questionable encounters and being fiercely devoted to this subreddit have led me to easily be scared and very aware of things that seem off. This is my first post, so I hope the formatting is right. For context, I'm 20, female, and I work alone in a desolate shop that connects to a brewery. I was at work on a Wednesday afternoon before Christmas and went over to the brewery to get something to drink during my shift. The time was 3 p.m. I went through the door that leads into the hall that connects the brewery to my shop. The place was unsurprisingly pretty dead. I noticed one man sitting alone facing the door I came in and was aware of him leering at me while I ordered. Whatever, nothing new. I went back in around 5 to get a refill and the dude was still there, which is odd because at a brewery, at least where I'm from, you can only consume 3 pints during a visit. He wasn't drinking anymore, but he waved at me when I came back in and continued leering at me. An hour later, he came into the store. He mulled around for a while and I asked my usual questions. Me. Hey, how's it going? Can I help you with anything? Him. No, I'm good, just shopping. Me. Okay, cool. Have you ever been in before? Him. No, but there was a good advertisement and name of brewery. He said this as he was very obviously looking me up and down. Me. Okay, let me know if I can get you anything. I returned to my place behind the counter just because I felt super uncomfortable, and having that little barrier made me feel better about it being just the two of us in there. Then he came up to the counter and started asking a few questions that seemed harmless enough. He asked how long I had my job, if I was a student, what my classes were like tomorrow, if I lived on campus or off campus, if I had roommates, how many, and how well we all get along. After a while, I was unsure that these questions could be him getting some information on me for some reasons other than small talk, so I kept my answers very vague. Then he started getting more personal and a little more creepy. Him. Do you usually work alone? Me. Yeah, almost always. Most of the time my boss comes to help me close, which was a lie. Him. Oh man, it must get scary working all alone in here. Me. It's not bad, I'm used to it. Him. What time do you close? Me. In about an hour. Him. Do you drive to work or walk? My response was, I drive. He then said, do you get to use a parking lot out front or is there employee parking? Me. I have to use street parking. He responds with, oh, that seems unsafe considering you're a girl and you're close by yourself at dark. Me. Severely creeped out now. My building manager walks me out every night. Then he said, I assume you don't leave out the front door because there's no keyhole outside the front door. Then he had just abruptly walked away. I was pretty freaked out that he went and looked at the front door and noticed there was no keyhole outside, especially because he said he'd never been in before. What was he doing, scoping out the lock on a front door? I spent the rest of my hour closing and trying to get my night out as normal. I called the building manager to see if he would walk me to my car, but unfortunately he had already gone home for the night. I locked up, shut off the lights, called my parents as I was setting the alarm. I told them some guy was hanging around the building all day, was asking me about closing, and it had just made me nervous. They were more than happy to be on the phone with me, and I had my pepper spray ready because I had a 2-block walk to my car in a dark neighborhood downtown. I left through the back door, walked around the corner to the stairs, and saw him just standing at the bottom looking up at me. I said, oh shit, here he is. When he realized I was on the phone, he looked nervous and walked quickly back up the stairs towards the brewery. I got to my car safely, but ever since then I've carried a heavy flashlight my dad bought me that would double as a bat. I'm a 16-year-old female, if anyone is wondering. Either way, this all started about 8 months ago. There's this creepy old man who started to come to my church. After church dismisses and everyone rushes out the door, he would sit outside on the benches the church had put out. And each time I would walk down the sidewalk, he would only stare at me walking to my mom or my brother's car in the parking lot. At first I thought maybe he was looking at my clothes and my hair, because people always compliment me on my fashion and hair. But it gets a little creepier, for me at least. Before my church started doing 3 services, the man and I would go to the same service. I would usually sit somewhere in front of the sanctuary, or off to the far side from the main doors. He would walk in, sit at the far back in the corner and stare. If he couldn't see me due to a lot of people being in the way, he would find another place to sit just to stare at me. Whenever I walk out the sanctuary before or during service, he would just stare at me walking out. And whenever I would come back, he would just stare at me walking back to my chair, and just continue to stare at me during the sermon. One time I was walking out after church let out. He followed me back to the church parking lot. I walked my usual route, and then I remembered my brother parked in the back parking lot, so I cut between the alley of the 2 buildings my church has. The old man was sitting on the bench as usual, staring at me. He then saw me take a turn into the alleyway, so as I was waiting at my brother's car, he got held up talking to someone in the sanctuary, and he didn't give me the key to his car because he's a dick. The creepy old man appeared 10 seconds later, out of the alleyway after I walked out, just stared me down while he walked along the building. His car wasn't even in the back, but the way he would walk and just stare at me creeped me out so much. For months he's been staring at me until finally my church got big enough that we added a 3rd service. This kind of helped for a while, because he would go to the 3rd service and I would go to the 2nd, but now he's starting to go to the 2nd service, because he's seen me walking out after the 2nd service dismisses. One time I was waiting for my mom outside in the hallway near the doors, and at first I didn't see him there. He had his phone out pointing towards me like he was taking a photo, but trying to be discreet about it. As soon as I turned and saw him on his phone pointed towards me, he quickly put it away and tried to act normal. Last Sunday he was sitting behind me and just staring at me. I got so uncomfortable I just picked out my bag and sat somewhere else. I know this isn't as creepy as some entries on here, but it's creeping me out horribly. It's getting to the point I'm getting scared to go to my own church. I've told my parents, my friend, brother, and even the security team at our church. I haven't told my mom about the phone incident because I'm not sure enough if he was actually taking a picture of me or not. My friend told me last Sunday that he even stares at her now, and it's creeping her out. Should I be concerned about this? When I was 15, my brother, 2 of our cousins, and I used to spend a week up north with my grandparents on a piece of land in Wisconsin that they bought. To set the scene, the land was about 5 acres in a rural part of the state, and the neighbors around us were summer people who only came up on weekends, meaning midweek was pretty desolate. My grandparents had 2 RV trailers on their land, one for their use and one for guest use. At 15, my grandparents decided to let my cousin, who was 13, and I use a guest RV, just because they thought we were old enough to be by ourselves. They kept my 11-year-old brother and 10-year-old cousin in their trailer. I had just returned from a week in Washington, D.C. with friends, so most of our nighttime rituals included gossiping about D.C. and the boy I had a crush on who was still there as well. Nothing concerning happened the first few nights. As a precaution, my grandparents gave us a car key fob and an intercom just in case we got scared. Oh boy, how I didn't know that this would be used on one of our last nights here. It was around 10 p.m. and my grandparents and the others had gone to sleep, so we walked over to the other trailer. As we got in the trailer, we started to change, when something in my head popped up. We hadn't locked the door. The voice in my head urged me to lock it. We had both been admittedly bad about this. I went back and locked it, and my cousin and I went to talking at the table. As my cousin talked about the boy she liked, I got this feeling of dread. I noticed that I stopped listening to her, and after a minute she did too. She asked me what was wrong, and I shushed her. Outside the window next to us, shades were drawn. We heard a shuffling noise as if someone was walking back and forth in front of the window. This went on for 5 solid minutes. The noise approached the door, and I immediately hit the intercom button, calling my grandfather. I told him there were weird noises outside. Whoever was outside could almost likely hear us talking because of the thin walls. We could still hear the shuffling. My grandfather's voice rang out over the intercom. "I'm grabbing my gun. I'll be right there." At that second, the shuffling stopped. I heard my grandfather rip open the door to his trailer. He yelled out. He ran to our door and knocked, telling me it was him. I opened the door. To this day, I've never seen such a look of crazed terror on my grandfather's face. He was holding his gun, and he asked us to follow him to his camper. We obliged and grabbed the stuff we needed. My brother and cousin and grandma were sitting up in the next camper. My grandmother looked terrified as she sat in the window, staring out past us. We settled in and slept, but she sat there awake all night. The next day, we left 2 days early for home. My grandparents, to this day, tell us it was probably an animal and to shush us about the story. I'm 22, so it's been a while. I know it was a person. So does my cousin. But if I could go back, I would have ripped up those blinds so I could have made sure and not had to live with the wonder of who was on the other side. Let me preface this by saying this is 100% true, and I don't scare easily. So I don't know why I haven't posted anything about this weird experience on Reddit before. I guess I just forgot about this experience. Anyways, a few months ago I was walking around in the woods in my neighborhood. Seeing as I live in a more rural area, nothing much happened. I was just walking around. That is until I started to walk back from the deeper part of the woods. I was walking when out of the corner of my eye I saw a man. The thing about him, though, was he was standing in the middle of a field, holding a baseball bat, looking like he could snap at any moment. He was looking into a part of the forest that had houses. He had a long gray beard and looked older, like an old biker. Afterwards I saw this. I ran like my life depended on it. Maybe it did. As you can imagine, I stayed out of the woods for a while.
When I was about 14, I lived in a house in the country with my parents. The house we were living in was built during the early 1900s, so it was pretty old. My parents would work during the week while I went to school, and they would get off at work around 6, and I got home from school around 3. So I would always be home alone on most weekdays, unless one of my parents were sick or on their day off. So on this particular day, the clouds were dark and was getting ready to rain. I have to walk to and from school, so I knew I had to walk fast to get to my house before it rained. I approached my house within 5 minutes, and I finally made it before it rained. As I walked to the back door of the house, I saw that it was open. I thought that maybe my parents had forgot to shut it, but that wouldn't make sense because my parents are super strict about leaving doors open. I just figured that they forgot and simply walked into the house. When I heard my bedroom door shut, I said, "Mom?" There was no answer. I opened my bedroom door and saw a man crouched down behind my bed. I gasped and ran out of that house and called the sheriff. When they arrived, the man was gone and I never stayed home alone for a while and I stayed after school. This happened about 2 years ago. I was going camping in the woods in West Virginia. I liked camping mainly because I enjoyed the outside and overall the nature. But now, I'm never going camping again. This happened on a Thursday, and I was on vacation from work. So when I arrived, I found a place to camp, pitched my tent, and unpacked. I do have to watch out for predators like bears, bobcats, coyotes, and even snakes. So anyway, it was getting late, so I decided to hunt for dinner. I got a rattlesnake and roasted it over the fire I had built. However, as I was eating, I thought I heard something coming from the woods from behind me. I turned around to see a huge male buck standing about 15 feet away. However, there was something slightly off about it. It just didn't look normal. There was something about its eyes. They looked like the eyes of a human. I turned back around and thought nothing of it, when I hear a loud, terrifying scream. I turned back around, and the deer was standing up on its 2 back legs. I then saw it run into the woods still on its 2 legs. I slowly turned back around, wondering what I just saw. Let me say this, though. I don't believe in skinwalkers, but I have no other explanation for this. This didn't happen to me, but rather my mom and dad. This happened during the summer of 1994. My mom and dad were driving to California for a vacation at a nice resort by the beach. Anyway, they ended up on a deserted road, and they thought they took a wrong turn. My dad then kept driving, thinking that they would find their way back, but it looked like that there was no civilization for miles. Anyway, a few minutes later, they saw something on the side of the road. As they drove towards it, they realized that it was a white van. My dad stopped the car and saw that all of the doors were open. It seemed as if whoever was in there abandoned the van. Its lights were still on and the engine was still running. Whoever got out of that van hadn't been gone for long. However, he noticed a horrible smell coming from the van, but he couldn't find the source. He looked everywhere around the van but found absolutely nothing. My dad was about to call the police, but he accidentally dropped his phone on the ground. He bent down to pick it up and happened to look under the van and found a dead body of a woman. He screamed and ran back to the car and drove off. My parents called the cops, but I don't know what else happened.
When I was 18, I got a job at Walmart. Small town, not much else there for someone fresh out of high school. I'd been there about a month and worked in the jewelry department, usually from mid-afternoon until the department closed at 9 p.m. I would close the department myself, but obviously, Walmart is open 24 hours, so other people were always around. One night I'm locking the cases up and putting things away, and an overnight stalker walks by and says hi. I look up, smile, and say hi back, then go about my business. This guy. The only way I can describe him is to say he looks like one of the Bee Gees. Shoulder-length frizzy hair, kind of a bouncy hop to his step when he walked, mid-50s. This started to become a regular thing on nights I closed by myself. He'd walk by and say hi, and I would say hi back. That's it. No conversations ever took place. Then on my birthday, a few of my friends who worked there got me a cake. I hugged them, said thank you, etc. About an hour later, Mr. BG comes around with a birthday card and gave it to my manager to give to me. My manager thought it was extremely funny that this weirdo got me a card, until I opened it. Happy birthday. I saw you hugging those guys earlier. It made me really mad, but I called a friend and talked it out, and he made me realize you're allowed to have friends other than me. Just please don't hug them anymore. Save those hugs for me. I don't know what kind of emotion showed on my face, but my manager grabbed the card and read it, then walked me back to the store manager's office and showed it to him. Store manager said the guy was obviously joking, but that he would talk to him about it. I didn't see Mr. Bee Gees for around a week, until one night while I was closing, he plunked down a stuffed envelope on my counter as he walked by without a word. Inside was 6 pages, front and back, of pure crazy. It was basically his entire life story, all about his family and schools he went to, but with weird stuff like how his sister was a psychic and his father was an exorcist and all sorts of weirdness. The end of the letter was about how his friend, who was 18 months old, was missing, and he knew she was being raped because he could hear her screaming his name in his dreams. What the fuck? So that also went to the store manager, and he had me write a written complaint, and he told me not to go outside by myself and not to wander near where the guy might be while I'm on my breaks. No. Get rid of him. 2 nights later, I was finishing up for the night, and the way the counter is set up, there is one opening, and the counters go all the way around both sides. He brought a hand cart around with boxes from my department, but pushed it into the only opening in the counter, so I was trapped inside. So that also went to the store manager, and he had me write a written complaint, and he told me not to go outside by myself, and not to wander near where the guy might be while I'm on my breaks. No. Get rid of him. 2 nights later, I was finishing up for the night, and the way the counter is set up, there is one opening, and the counters go all the way around both sides. He brought a hand cart around with boxes from my department, but pushed it into the only opening in the counter, so I was trapped inside. He just stood there and stared at me while I looked at him with what I'm sure was terror. I was then, and still am now, riddled with anxiety. I don't like confrontation, and the last thing I wanted was for this weirdo to confront me about reporting him. Twice. He whispers, "Sorry, didn't mean to scare ya." I turned around and started finishing my closing tasks, pretending he wasn't there, even though I could feel him watching me. After a few minutes, I just looked at him and said, "Weren't you told to stay away from me?" He gave me this gross predator grin and said, "The store manager asked me if I was joking. I told him I was." Then he leaned in, as close to me as he could get with the counter between us, and whispered, "But I'm not joking." Then he walked away. For 2 weeks after that, he would randomly show up wherever I was. I would leave for lunch, he would be there. Even non-work places. I would go to the mall, he would be there. Another department manager told me he had been reported by 4 other people over the last 2 years for very similar behavior. I, again, went to my store manager, who told me the guy was harmless and maybe he had a little bit of a crush. He was in his 50s, and I was 18 during this crap. A week later, I gave my notice and quit. He still works there, 13 years later. Still gives me the heebie-jeebies. When I was 22, I moved 1,000 miles away from my Midwest home to the beautiful foothills of Tennessee. I had a new job, new car, a nice apartment, but didn't know a soul outside of work. If my phone rang, I expected to hear a faraway family member or my long-distance boyfriend who was still in college. This was a landline, no cell phones yet. Despite being very alone, I was managing well with the excitement of all the new things in my life. I had only lived there about 2 weeks when the unwanted calls started. The first call, a man's friendly voice asked what I was doing. I couldn't place him and thought maybe it was one of my cousins or uncles. I have a huge extended family. I ask his name. He laughs a little and his tone gets dark, a bit angry. He says, "You know exactly who this is, darlin'." I pause, deciding if this guy simply called the wrong number or is a creep. I choose the former, laugh, and politely tell him he has the wrong number. He then recites my brand new, unlisted, unpublished phone number and my name. What the fuck? An intense chill runs through me. I've only given my new number to my parents, sister, boyfriend, apartment manager, and employer. I'm new to this city and this lovely southern state. He does not like it when I tell him he called the wrong number and starts yelling at me, then tells me in a much calmer voice the many vulgar things he's going to do to me. I hang up and brush it off. He calls again around 1 a.m. I tell him to fuck himself and hang up. He keeps calling, so I unplug the phone and return to sleep. However, as days go by, the calls continue and escalate. He starts mentioning personal things about me. Said he liked the white quilt on my bed, knew what was in my fridge, that he's allergic to cats, which I had one, and then asked me if I was in love with Mary. As I listened to his words, I was standing in my kitchen looking at the calendar taped to the fridge. It had Mary written in pink on the 17th with a heart around it. Because Mary is my sister, and the 17th is her birthday. I started shaking and crying, because suddenly I realized this creep has been in my apartment. I was alone, with no friends or family to run to for the night. It was me versus a creepy mystery man. I didn't sleep much that night. Early the next morning, I talked to the apartment complex manager before heading to work, telling her what happened and that I want the locks changed that day. She gets a weird look on her face, and after a long pause, says she knows who has been in my apartment, and that it won't happen again. What? Turns out she had a creepy, rapey maintenance guy who noticed a young woman moving into an apartment alone, and thought that I was his new pet. She had the locks changed immediately, and promised that she would personally keep the other key. Although the calls stopped, I was paranoid for a year as I came and went from my apartment, because I never even knew what this guy looked like. I moved out the moment my lease was up. Only after thinking about it years later did I realize that her weird expression likely meant it had happened before. Plus, she didn't even fire him. I regret not calling the cops. I was young and naive.